There are so many incredible wine regions around France, and it's honestly subjective to be able to rank favorites, but this is my show. So today I'm going to be taking you through my favorite wine regions that I got to visit this last summer. I spent 8 weeks traveling around France, and I spent time in some of the major wine regions across the country. And I'm here today to tell you which ones are my favorite and which ones weren't and why. Hi friends, my name is Sarah. I'm a certified sommelier and host of the Wine CEO podcast. And every week on the Wine CEO, I bring a different wine topic to you, the listener, in a fun and approachable way to help make wine less intimidating. Today on the show, I'm going to be recapping my last 6 months of this France mini series that we've been on for quite some time, talking about a lot of the major wine regions within France. Now, I did not get to visit every single region in France, and there's still so much more that I want to see, and I'll talk about that in today's episode. So know that today's episode is completely my personal opinions and not a structured wine industry recommendation. So take everything with a grain of salt because it all comes from my perspective and my view from traveling through France this summer. And check these regions out for yourself. They're all incredible in their own way. I'm just going to be telling you some of my favorites and why. All right, so I'm just gonna go ahead and drop the bomb for you all right now here at the start of the episode. My favorite wine regions were Champagne and Burgundy. And not gonna lie to you, this surprised me. I don't know, for some reason, when I was traveling to France, I was convinced that Bordeaux and the Rhone were going to be my favorites. Probably because I would have told you before traveling there that the wines coming out of these regions were my favorite wines to drink from France. And so I just was convinced that I was going to love these two wine regions as well. But to be honest, as I was driving around both regions, I felt like the Rhone, first of all, was just a little too industrial. Now, I only went to the Northern Rhone, in all fairness. I haven't been to the Southern Rhone yet. But same thing with Bordeaux, really industrial, kind of a bigger hustle and bustle vibe to the city. And I really loved driving around the quaint, smaller villages and communes in both of those areas. But when I was just thinking about comparing them to some of the other regions that I traveled to, I felt like Champagne and Burgundy both just had this really quaint, beautiful vibe that I really loved. Now, granted, there were some beautiful communes all around Bordeaux and the Rhone as well, but you really had to drive long distances to get there. And so from a vacationing perspective, the logistics just weren't as easy. And I felt like in the Rhone specifically, there wasn't a lot to do outside of wine tasting. The region is just a little less developed when it comes to wine tourism. Really, wine tourism was not that big at all. In fact, traveling in the region, I would stop at a winery and most of them would just give me a free tasting because they didn't get that many visitors. They didn't have like typical tours that were coming through to taste wines. And this was actually the case in a lot of like cellar doors, but also in a lot of wine shops in the city as well. So just a really interesting vibe. And that made it fun because it was very quaint and the Rhone felt very untouched, but it definitely gave it a different vibe as you were traveling around the region as a wine tourist. And with Bordeaux, I just felt like the city was a little more hustle bustle. I mentioned in my first episode of the Bordeaux series that I was just coming from Paris. So in all fairness, I was comparing Bordeaux to Paris and I loved Paris so much more. I stayed in Saint-Emilion, and so it was a beautiful little medieval town. But again, I just felt like the region was a little bit harder to drive around and get through. And it wasn't as picturesque or as beautiful as some of the other regions that I'd been traveling to. I also didn't feel like the wineries or individuals just in the area were quite as welcoming of wine tourists. It felt like it was much more structured, much more polished, much more industrial. It was definitely more commercialized than the other regions that I had traveled to. And so I felt like that was kind of the vibe of Bordeaux that I just didn't find quite as welcoming either. And the Loire was really beautiful. I loved visiting like the historic castles of the region, but I felt like the wineries were so spread out. So you really can't do a lot of wine tasting while you're there unless you have like just days and days. Wine tourism is also still really growing in that region. And so it's a little difficult to get around, to taste a lot of wineries at various locations while you're there. And the smaller towns were really cute, lots of, historical medieval kind of castles and things to see. But I don't feel like I would go out of my way again to visit this region just because it was really beautiful and there was a lot to see. But again, as a wine tourist, it was just a little more challenging. So I'm going to give you some quick rankings here. And again, this is all totally subjective and my personal opinion. So if I'm ranking the best food, I would say by far that was in the Rhone. You're really close to Lyon, which is considered the gastronomic capital of France and possibly the world. So by far, best food I had was in Rhone. It's phenomenal. If you're going to go to the northern Rhone, definitely make sure you make a stop in Lyon so that you can enjoy some of the incredible food first. I would love to go back to the Rhone because I want to experience the southern Rhone as well, but best food, it was phenomenal. For driving, I would say that Burgundy was the easiest to drive around. It's a lot of smaller villages, so you don't have a lot of traffic. As someone who is very comfortable driving abroad, I still found that some of the other big cities could get a little complicated or confusing because of the traffic, and Burgundy was so easy to drive around. And also the views are beautiful. You're just driving down these long stretches of incredible rows of vineyards. I mean, it's just stunning. You can't beat it. I felt like the most welcoming for wine tourism was Champagne. It was so easy to get around as a tourist in Champagne. There's great structure. There's a lot of wonderful tours. Most of the wineries are very used to tourists. And so not that it's a overly populated area with tons of tourists. I think that it is a popular area with tourists coming maybe on a day trip from Paris or a long weekend, but you can still feel like you're in quaint little villages and enjoy that small aspect of the local wineries as well. So it's not overrun with tourists, but I found that the area was most welcoming for wine tourists. So again, it was set up and structured really well. And I think they're just a little bit farther along in their journey of being prepared and structured for wine tourism than a lot of the other regions around France. I would say that the best region for non-wine lovers would be the Loire. I mean, it really is beautiful. And again, getting to see the historic castles, there's a lot of fun activities to do in the area. I got to go on a hot air balloon ride. There's horseback riding through the vineyards. I mean, it's definitely set up to be a wonderful, again, kind of like long weekend from Paris. You could probably try and do it in a day trip because it's not too far, but it's a beautiful region. And so I think if you have a lot of folks in your group that are not big wine drinkers and you want to make sure there's a little bit of something for everyone, the Loire is a beautiful region for that because there's a lot of fun things to do. The most accessible, in my opinion, though, was the Champagne region. So again, it's a very quick distance from Paris by train. You can be there in like 45 minutes. Very easy to drive there, very easy to drive around from one village to the next. And I think you can experience some larger towns as well as a lot of smaller villages as well. So lots of wine tasting options, really easy to get around, very close to Paris. And so I would say probably the most accessible when it comes to visiting a wine region in France. And I definitely have to caveat all of my comments here by saying that there are still so many amazing regions in France that I haven't had a chance to visit yet. I was so disappointed because I really, really wanted to visit Alsace while I was in France, and I just could not make it work out with the time that I was spending in Paris and then the weeks that I had on either end to do a lot of my wine tasting and tours. I just wasn't able to squeeze in Alsace, and I'm still so disappointed. You can tell I'm totally gutted, but I've decided that it would be amazing to see Alsace during Christmas time because you have that Germanic influence, and so there are beautiful Christmas markets. And so I would love to definitely go back and visit Alsace because that is one of the top wine regions in France as well. And obviously I didn't make it to Alsace. Then there's the Southern Rhone, there's Corsica, there's Languedoc-Roussillon, there's Provence, there's so many regions, the Jura, there's so many incredible regions around France. And so I did not get to visit them all. So I'm going to say that this is a very unfair assessment of the best regions within France because I have not even scratched the surface of all of them, but these are probably the more major wine regions and the ones that most folks are going to be familiar with. So if you're looking to travel to France and you're trying to pick like one region, hopefully I'm giving you some tips on which one might appeal to you and your travel party, but definitely know that it can't be a complete list because I haven't visited all of them yet. All right, now if you're going to ask me, well, which region had the best wine? This is so subjective and I'm not even gonna really answer it because obviously I can't give a ranking on something that is so personal, right? So if you're really into more bold red wines, you would love the wines of the Rhone and Bordeaux. If you like wines that are maybe a little bit softer in approach, or maybe you love bubbles, right? Okay, so Burgundy or Champagne are gonna be your favorite. So I'm speaking very simplistically here, but it's hard to rank a region saying that it has the best wine. What I will say though is I was really impressed in a couple different regions. I loved being able to try some of the wines that are not considered like traditional varietals for that region or even traditional styles. So for example, in Champagne, I was blown away with the Côte Champenois, and these are still wines being made in the Champagne region. So I think that's a huge advantage you have when you're traveling to one of the regions that you typically drink wine from. You might be able to experience some wines that are made by incredible winemakers in that region that you wouldn't be able to get in your wine store or a restaurant in your hometown or in places you've traveled to, because they might be such a small production that they're exclusive to the market in that wine region or within France or whatever, or whichever country you're focused on. And so that's a really fun thing about traveling to a region. And I always recommend to folks, make sure that you ask the local winery or wine tour guide about wines outside of the traditional varieties and things that are being made there. I will say here too that it's really good to visit regions that you don't think are going to be your favorite. So again, I was convinced that Burgundy was not going to be my favorite. For some reason, I've never been that obsessed with Burgundy. I think because it's that region that everyone else in the world is so in love with that I had just decided like, no, I'm gonna let everyone else have Burgundy and I'm gonna, find my hidden gem elsewhere. And so I had kind of written it off, and I only gave myself like 3.5 days in Burgundy. And I was like, that'll be great, that'll be fine. I just need to like check it off the list, say I did Burgundy, and then move on. And then I got there and I fell in love. I absolutely fell in love with Burgundy. I just fell in love with the beauty of the region, with the people that were there, with the food, because you're not that far from Lyon and you're kind of perfectly positioned between Lyon and Paris. And so there's just incredible food. And the wines really surprised me too. I think because I hadn't really spent a lot of time focused on this region, I think I was just blown away. I was really surprised. And so I think that's another fun thing to mention when you're looking at traveling to a region. Don't be closed off by what you've experienced in the past or your preconceived notions. Be willing to experience a new region or maybe something that you have written off, and come in with an open mind and just enjoy it for what it is. I think I was really grateful that I only did a few days in each region as I was traveling. I didn't commit like 2 weeks to one specific region. I guess I did spend about a week and a half in Champagne. But I think it's really good to do these smaller trips first, because then you can kind of figure out which region is a favorite and where you want to go back to and maybe spend a whole week or two, right? So I'm kind of turning my favorites list into a bit of a travel tips, which I already did an episode on that. But I'm having fun like thinking about all of the various regions that I travel to and why, and talking about the different aspects of it in here. So yeah, hopefully if you're planning a trip, you're listening to this episode because you're curious which one you should travel to. And so hopefully I'm helping with that. But anyway, all that to say, I think Burgundy really surprised me, both with the wines and with the region, and I loved it so much more than I ever thought I would. So there's a reason why it's a favorite, and there's a reason why everyone loves it, because it really is that amazing and well worth the visit. Now, a question I get asked often is what's the best time of year to go to various French wine regions? And so this is a little difficult to answer because it's going to be different depending on the region. So for example, my friend Jeannie and I visited Bordeaux in July. It was so hot. 0 out of 10 do not recommend going in July because it's so hot. But we were in Champagne in August and it was beautiful, right? There were some warm days, but it was also kind of cool because it's farther north, right? I was in the Rhone in late June, early July, and it was beautiful. It's in the south, so it would have been really hot in the summer, but obviously early in the summer, it was really pleasant. And so I think it kind of depends from region to region. So it's important to remember, based on where it's located, there's a different time of the year that's probably the perfect time to visit. So if you're trying to think of the best time to visit France, I would look at the region you're going to. Are you going to be in the north? Are you going to be in the south? Obviously, in cooler months, it's probably better to be in the south, whereas in warmer months, it might be better to be in the north. So keep that in mind as you're looking at like kind of the best time to visit each region. So I'm often asked if you only had one region that you could visit, so you only have time to visit one wine region when you're in France, what would I pick? And this is also a really subjective question, and so it's very difficult to answer because I think it depends on what kind of wine you like. I think it depends on if you're more into history or food or other activities, like what else are you gonna do while you're on your trip? Are you gonna be going to Paris first? Are you gonna spend a lot of your time in the city? So then you wanna stick with regions that are close to Paris. So I think it's really hard. My first introduction to a French wine region was Champagne a few years ago. I think it's a fabulous place to start. I love Champagne because I think it's close to Paris, and I feel like most tourists coming to France for the first time are probably going to make a stop in Paris at some point. But the wine tourism scene is really well established, and so that helps as a first-time traveler to the region, especially if you're just trying to start to learn about French wine. I think that it's well structured, it's really easy to access tastings and tours, there's really accessible restaurants and hotels. So I think all of this balanced with great history and things to do in the region, Champagne is a really great place to start. Also, who doesn't love bubbles? So I think it's also just a crowd pleaser, right? Like whether you're going with a group of girlfriends or you and your spouse or a family trip, everybody loves champagne, and so you're going to find something for everybody. So again, there are still wines that are being made there. So for those who are absolutely vehement that they don't want sparkling wine, you can find some great still wines, but I think that it's a crowd pleaser region. So I would definitely say if you can only visit one and you have to start somewhere, start with Champagne. I think it's the perfect region to start with. But then I think if you are looking for something a little more off the beaten path, maybe you've done Paris before, you've done Champagne, or you're not going to Paris, it kind of depends on where else you're traveling to. But if you want to do something a little different, I would fly into Lyon and then do like a day at first in Lyon of the incredible food scene there, because it's amazing. If you need recommendations, send me a message because there's some great restaurants. But then I would drive up to Burgundy and I would enjoy incredible wines, incredible food, beautiful views, the historic wineries, and you drive between Lyon and Dijon, and you just have this incredible wine route of some amazing wineries. It's a very easy trip to do in a couple days, and then you can end up in Paris. So you can fly into Lyon, travel through up to Dijon, drive over to Paris, fly out of Paris, very easy trip, and a beautiful region. So I think that's a really fun trip to do. So if I absolutely had to rank my regions, you can probably already guess that my number one would probably be Burgundy, at least from this last trip this summer, because it just really surprised me. I felt like it had this perfect balance of incredible food, it had outstanding wines, really friendly winemakers, and the region just has amazing history. And so accessible to get around, really relaxing wine destination. I had already been to Champagne, and so to be honest, if I hadn't been to Champagne before, Champagne might have been my number one. So it's hard to rank here, but I think it's my number two. I think Champagne is just a really beautiful region. I think it's picturesque, it's easy to get around, has some incredibly renowned wines from around the world, right? I think it can be considered like a little more bougie for some travelers. But in addition to these big champagne houses, you also have a lot of small grower producers. So there's a lot to explore in the region. And I think that you find some hidden gems in the local champagne community in these smaller villages. And so you'll absolutely fall in love with every aspect of Champagne while you're there. And so I think that it is just an absolutely really incredible region, easy to get around, and very fun and approachable. My third favorite, I think, would have to be the Rhone, just because I really enjoyed the wine tasting here. I felt, again, like I was one of very few wine tourists. I felt like I was kind of in this like off the beaten path wine region. Everyone was so kind and wonderful. I mean, the locals of the Rhone Valley are just so friendly, so amazing. I think the food scene was unreal. You can do a lot of really beautiful cruises through the Rhone River, and so I think that makes for a really interesting way to see the region. Just looking at like the sunrise over the hills of the Rhone, it's a really beautiful region. And again, I think proximity to Lyon gives it some phenomenal wine. I'm a huge foodie, and so I loved being in the Rhone, and I think it's definitely an underrated region when it comes to wines. I think that there's some incredible bargain wines in the Rhone Valley, and so I think you can find some amazing wines. You can be in a region that is not as well known to a lot of wine consumers around the world, and so it can feel like a really unique experience compared to Champagne, Burgundy, Bordeaux, right? Some of the kind of bigger, more well-known wine regions. Okay, now ranking these last two is really hard, and I don't know why I'm like putting so much pressure on myself. I like feel bad putting a wine region into last place because I feel like I'm like saying it's bad, but it's not. Here's the thing, truly, like I love all five of these wine regions. They're amazing. There's great wines. How can you not love traveling to a wine region? Honestly, like at the end of the day, any wine region in the world is going to have great food, wonderful people, you're drinking great wine, like you can't go wrong. But I visited these five, and so I'm putting them into a ranking. And so I'm just being honest about when I'm comparing these five side by side, what my favorites were. So In my opinion, I think I would put Bordeaux into the number 4 slot. So I felt like the wines were better. And this is very subjective, but I just think that because of the history of the Bordeaux region and how long the winemaking has really been scrutinized and perfected, I just think that you have this really unique history and these phenomenally made wines all across the region. I think that tourism is a little more established in Bordeaux as well, so that made it a little bit easier to get around or to find like tours in Bordeaux. Again, I wasn't as crazy about Bordeaux because I just felt like it was really industrial when it came to the atmosphere of the city. I think the region felt really commercialized, and so traveling around to the various communes, it just didn't feel as warm and welcoming. It kind of felt like they were used to a lot of tourists coming in and out because they knew it was a really, popular destination. And I'm being really unfair here because obviously I only spent like 3 days in the region. So there's so much more to see. And I'm really excited to go back to Bordeaux in the future. But again, when I'm ranking it compared to some of these other regions, it just wasn't my favorite. So yeah. And so then that obviously leaves the Loire Valley for number 5 on the list. I really did like visiting the Loire. But sadly, I found that what I loved most about the Loire was visiting the beautiful historic castles and then my hot air balloon ride over the vineyards. I think when it came to wine tasting and wine tourism, the region just has a little bit of work to do. It is not quite as established. You have to drive a little bit farther. And so it's a little more difficult as a visitor to be able to enjoy the wine region. I think they're going to get there. You can tell that wine tourism is picking up. You can tell that wineries are trying to welcome visitors. They're building guest houses and Airbnbs and things like that. And there's some amazing wines that are coming from the Loire Valley as well. They just typically tend to be a little bit more like young, light, fresh, and fruity, which appeals to a certain consumer. And I'll be honest, is just not typically the wine that I'm drawn to. I usually go for a wine that's a little more deep and like really hedonistic. And so that wasn't exactly what I found in the Loire, but it has amazing wines, it has really great food, and it has a beautiful history. It has just a lot of wonderful things to do. And so definitely not hating on the Loire. I really enjoyed traveling there, and I'm excited to go back again in the future because I think there's a lot that I didn't get to see as well. But if I absolutely had to rank my list of 5, there you go. You have it. So I had Burgundy as number 1, Champagne as number 2, the Rhone as 3, Bordeaux as 4, and the Loire as 5. And again, still lots of amazing regions around France that I haven't visited yet and I hope to be able to do in the near future. And then I can rank those and add them to the list and talk to you all about what to expect and enjoy in those wine regions too. So hopefully you enjoyed today's episode, and it was just a fun, quick overview of my personal opinions from my trip to France this last summer and a little bit more into each of the fun French wine regions that I got to visit. If you loved today's episode, don't forget to like and share it with a friend. That's the best way for new folks to learn about my show, if you can share it with them by word of mouth. If you haven't subscribed to my show yet, please do so now. I'm going to be diving into some really fun topics over the next couple weeks. I think you're going to be glad to have a little bit of a break from France. And so I'm going to be talking about a lot of different wine regions around the world. I have some really fun interviews coming up in the next couple weeks. So definitely subscribe to my show if you haven't before. If you have any questions about this episode, traveling to France, any of the episodes that I've done in this France mini series, or just wine in general, don't forget that you can always send me an email, sarah@thewineceo.com, and Sarah is SARA. You can also send me a DM on Instagram @thewineceo, and I would be so happy to give any help I can as you're moving in your wine journey, just as a wine enthusiast, as a traveler, as a student, whatever it may look like. Please let me know how I can help. I love being your pocket sommelier. Until next episode, friends, I hope you drink something new and delicious, and I will catch you all in the next episode of the Wine CEO podcast.